Good afternoon, everyone. Very good to see you. And we've got an exciting agenda today. We're going to be talking about healing systems. I'm Jo Blundell. I'm co-lead at Place Matters, and we'll explain a little bit more about who Place Matters are in a few seconds. But what we want to explore is trauma, but trauma from a systemic perspective. Many of you will be familiar with trauma-informed practice in the way you work, in the way colleagues that work with communities work. But today we want to explore how trauma shows up from a systems perspective. How do our systems of service, our systems of policy, our systems of entitlement or welfare, for example, create and reinforce trauma for people? And our focus very much today is on people, vulnerable people and vulnerable communities. So the very particular environment in places and people that are perhaps more likely to suffer the effects of systems that create trauma, or at least don't help heal from trauma that people experience. So we're going to have a discussion around those topics and hear from those who are thought leaders and practice leaders. And in this audience, we're going to be talking to, because we've invited many people that we hope will be particularly interested in this, who are the architects and leaders of service systems in many ways. So just to tell you a little bit about Place Matters, who we are, and kind of why we're looking to talk about this topic today. As the name suggests, we are an organisation that focuses on place, communities, and how people and places bring about the changes that they want to see. The part we play in that, and that's a very broad church of practice, is that we develop capacity, we improve practice through learning, we bring people together to learn from each other. Our work is very much centred in connectivity, connection, in peer conversations, and so we connect people to learn together. And we also develop work with funders and policymakers, those that enable this work in communities to happen well. So we hold around 4 webinars a year. We're hoping to increase that into next year. It's all free to access, and it's all really in the interests of developing a more generative environment for people doing this work. It's tough work, we all know it is, and it's also a very emergent practice. We're all still finding our ways into ways of doing this. So these webinars are really one way of contributing towards our development together as practitioners in our various ways that we do that. So we're all kind of able to, develop the way that we think and work. So we hope this one topic on which I think takes, for our point of view, as we've worked more with communities and see, particularly in vulnerable communities, the extent to which there's a mismatch between what people need and the way systems serve. And we're thinking increasingly about how we address that mismatch. And John and colleagues very helpfully and fairly recently developed a paper called Healing Systems, which crystallized for us some really important thinking around the way systems interact with people. We're perhaps much more familiar with trauma-informed practice as we work with individuals, but this asks us to think about something much broader. How does the system more widely contribute towards collective and individual trauma, and what can we do about it? So this is a practice discussion about what we're coming up with practical solutions, we hope. So we've got lots of interesting people here today. So I invite you, first of all, we're not going to do intros for obvious reasons, but if you'd like to sort of share who you are, where you're from in the chat, so people can just see who's here. It'd be just very interesting to know, for people to be able to connect with each other, of course, if there's some good connections to make. Format for today is to say a little bit more before I introduce our speakers. So we have an hour and a half together. We're going to spend the first bit for around 25 minutes or so, talking to John Kania and Allison Wainwright, who I'm going to introduce in a second. And then we're going to take, after that, a couple of questions from the chat. So as you think of things as we go through, please post them in the chat. Emily's going to be looking at the kind of things that come through and field those in the conversation that we're going to have through the session and at the end of the session. And then there'll be an opportunity at the end for you to participate, where we'll hopefully give around 20 minutes for you to ask questions directly if you'd like to. But please post the questions in the chat, and then we'll use that to kind of prompt the questions to the speakers. Then the other part, after we've spoken to John and Alison, is we'll be bringing in our other two guests, Cormac Russell and Lauren Seeger-Smith, who are going to be talking about their practice, their reflections, reflecting on what John and Alison have said from a UK perspective. So trying to ground this into what can we do about this in the UK and how do we need to work as practitioners. So I'd let me introduce now our contributors. We're very honoured to have 4 thought leaders, practice leaders, who are going to create a really interesting debate today. And we're going to spotlight them, I think, just so you can see them. So to start with John Kania, whose name I think will be familiar to many in this place-based practice world. John is a practitioner, a researcher, a writer, a teacher, and a speaker on how organisations and people can achieve change together. For 17 years, he ran FSG, again, an organisation who many of you will have dipped into their copious resources, a non-for-profit consulting firm and a think tank working across issues to support social and environmental change makers. And he's currently the founder and executive director of the Collective Change Lab, and I'll hear from him in a minute around what Collective Change Lab is and what it's working on. And he co-authored the paper that we're going to be, which Emily's put in the chat, if you don't have a copy of it, Healing Systems, which we're going to explore some of the themes in that today, which was published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review for those who subscribe. And John will also be best known to many for developing the Collective Impact Framework, which is a really key framework used by place-based change makers across the world. And John, I think, still the most read article in the SSR. I don't know if it still holds that, but it certainly has for many years held that accolade. Alison is the CEO of Family Life in Australia. She joins us generously at 9 o'clock in the evening after a very full day from Melbourne. She is a real expert in trauma-informed practice and in the areas of community change, family violence, children, youth and family services in Australia and many other places as well. And her skills are around programmatic design of community change and therapeutic systems, and trauma-informed interventions and family-sensitive practice. And she also contributed to John's article on healing systems, so her voice is very much in that. So they are co-authors in that sense of this paper that we're going to explore today. Just to introduce our respondents, we're going to talk to John and Alison for around a few minutes, but then to introduce the respondents will come after that. Cormac Russell is CEO of Nurture Development, who is the champion of strength-based practice, the ABCD, which many of you, again, a bit like Collective Impact, will be very familiar with. And he wrote Connected Community about the power of neighbourhoods with John McKnight, which I commend as a very good read. And today his argument, which we shall hear more about, is that help when done to communities can be experienced as violence and certainly as a negative experience, and how we need to centre relationships and connections in healing trauma. A theme I suspect we'll come to across all of the conversations. And Lauren Seeger-Smith is the CEO of For Baby's Sake, a UK charity that tackles the impact of domestic abuse and traumas in babies and parents, working with parents to change behaviours and getting to the root causes of trauma. So as you can see, we have an august contributors, and I'm sure many also of people on this meeting and this webinar will have lots of contributions as well. So I'm going to start with John and Alison. John, can I come to you first? Can you tell us a little bit about this Collective Change Lab. What prompted you and the Collective Change Lab to focus your work on trauma and healing?
Sure, Joe. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. It's great to be here with you and your colleagues and fellow panelists and all of you who are joining. So yeah, the Collective Change Lab is a global organization. We're focused on transformational change at a systems level, and we're 4 years old. And CCL, it's a continuation of the systems work that I've been doing for 15 years that sort of began with the advent of collective impact back in 2011. And how this came about was that, I worked in collective impact for many years. And I think what was kind of great was that, doing collective impact, we were actually seeing systems level change. We were seeing population level change. And that's still hard. There aren't a lot of sort of approaches that have yielded population level change. But the more I did the work, and I would say 6 to 7 years into doing the work, what I was feeling in the efforts that I was involved in and the research that we were doing around the world on collective impact was that at best I was seeing incremental change at a systems level, not transformational. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the system might be seeing movement in top line indicators, whether it was education or health or housing, et cetera, but the power dynamics in the system hadn't changed. The mental models hadn't shifted much, and there was limited sort of rewiring in the system of relationships and connections. And so these conditions, when we think about power and mental models and relationships and connections, we think about as sort of the relational conditions of systems change. Sometimes we call them the cultural conditions of systems change. But from my standpoint, being involved in the work for a while was that this was the real place to lean in if we wanted transformation, right? If we really wanted to see shifts in the system. So when we founded CCL, and that was about 4 years ago, we were focusing on the relational conditions of systems change and how we could help shift those, how we could help communities shift those. And when we dug into that more, we found that sort of the biggest crippler was fragmentation. Fragmentation of communities, fragmentation by sector, fragmentation of organizations, of teams, and even of individuals. Fragmentation. And so when we dug into that in terms of sort of what was sort of driving fragmentation, what we determined that the biggest driver was actually trauma and lack of integrating trauma at the individual, the organizational, and the system level. And so that's what has led us over the last 4 years. We didn't start. We started focusing on relational systems change, and we've sort of honed in on trauma and systems or trauma and collective healing at a systems level is where we're focused. Hopefully that made sense.
Yes, it does. I mean, perhaps it would be helpful for you to say a little bit more about what you mean by trauma and healing, and just bring it alive. So your paper is incredibly helpful in framing a much broader church of what we mean by trauma and how it's experienced in communities. And I wonder whether you could just lay that out a little bit.
Yeah, there are many definitions of trauma. I think the one that sort of feels right to me is that there's a wound that's sustained through an overwhelming event. And even when you move beyond the event, that sort of wound stays with you. And that's the trauma. And it's part of you that's been separated from a consciousness standpoint from yourself. And it's not until you start to heal that you can start to integrate that part that's been separated. And if you don't sort of work on integrating that trauma, it sticks with you and it, causes all sorts of challenges. And again, we think about this at an individual, organizational, and systems level.
Okay, it's helpful. And that sort of, do you see a difference between trauma as it's experienced by the individual and this more collective systems level trauma? What's the distinction in your mind between or how does it play out at a bigger scale?
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the thing. There was work done prior to the pandemic that said 70% of the world's population has experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form. And of course, there are all types of trauma. We can talk about those today. There's individual, there's collective, there's historical, there's ancestral. So we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that. And often I think when people hear trauma, they could think PTSD. But what we're talking about is a whole series of things that cause that wound. And so Goodness, I just lost my train of thought. Can you
And the type,
read?
sorry, I was just asking you to talk about the sort of types of trauma. So what do you
Oh
mean
yeah,
by
no.
trauma?
It's individual and systems. Yeah. So 70% of the world's population prior to the pandemic had experienced trauma. So we would assume it's even higher today, right? And
Yeah.
so that, we have that many people in the world's population that have people are experiencing trauma. And if people are experiencing trauma and people make up systems, then systems are experiencing trauma, right? And so there's a lot less. What we were trying to do in the article was bring visibility to the fact that, we need to move beyond, yes, we need to focus on individual trauma, particularly in vulnerable and marginalized communities, but there's a whole set of trauma that's in the system because people make up systems. And so that's where we want to try to focus and say, well, how do we actually address trauma at a systems level?
Just to remind people, just to mute
I'm
yourself,
just
if you wouldn't mind, please.
listening to a very interesting thing around
Hello.
healing trauma.
All right, let's just. Hello, everybody. Yes.
Sorry, Jo, you're on mute for me.
Yeah, I'm now back on, hopefully. Sorry,
Okay.
to mute everybody and then put ourselves back in. I do apologize for that. So you were talking, John, about this how trauma turns out, what we mean by systems trauma. Sorry, I probably cut into your train of thought again there, but please carry on.
Well, maybe, I think it's interesting. First of all, I also want to just say how delighted I am that Allison, you're on this panel as well. So we wrote this article, Healing Systems. It was published February 2024. Allison was when we in terms of sort of developing the thinking behind the paper, we interviewed probably 100 people around the world who were involved in social change and sort of working with trauma, and we also interviewed a lot of people who were healers, and that was sort of formed the basis of our research for the paper. And Allison was one of the people we went to again and again and again, and had many amazing conversations. And I think, Allison, you really helped us, sort of clarify our thinking. So I want to just acknowledge and thank you for your participation in that. But what's interesting is the article, which was published in, as I said, February of 2024, was the most popular article in Stanford Social Innovation Review for the years, which is kind of interesting to me because this is not a topic that is really all that much talked about in the sector. At least that's my experience. So, and yet there appears to be, sort of a thirst for this topic and sort of a resonance in this topic. And so what we're all trying to do, I think, is try to bring more visibility to this at both the individual and the systems level, that it needs to be a part of how we sort of think about, social change writ large.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. We'll dig into the paper a little bit, but let me bring Allison in just to, Alison, do you say a little bit more about what you, but Family Life do, what it means to have a trauma-informed practice and how that is how you kind of see that in Australia, and why it's so critical to the work?
Yeah, thank you, Jo, and hello to everyone on the call. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, on the land of the Eora people, but I traditionally support community on the land of the Bunurong people down in Melbourne. I'm in Sydney tonight. So thanks for making time and inviting me onto the call. So the organisation I lead, the CEO of Family Life, it has been around for over 50 years, and our central theory of change is always focused on supporting children and families within communities. And we bring that to life through a practice lens that focuses on relationships and connections. So I've been excited to really hear those words in the mix tonight. And that theory of change has really shaped our mental model around how we can support change more broadly in our place, in our part of the world. Because like so many on the call tonight or today for you guys, we get services that could very easily be clustered into problem buckets, so family violence, we get a lot of family violence money, and we get lots of work in the child protection support space and drug and alcohol work. But what we do at Family Life and how we frame that work is to think about a mental model that privileges relationships and connections, but also recognises that when those are not in place, what we see is relational deficit that makes it really hard for people and therefore for communities and systems, because I agree with you, John, that's all, people make up communities and systems to function optimally. So for our organisation, we have a deep commitment to building a trauma-capable lens that really prioritises that human element of connection. And like so many other organisations that are with us today, we really focus on that idea that we do learn to be human from other people, and everything about our human experience, the way we communicate, the way we co-regulate with each other, the way we risk take, the way we form and maintain relationships across the lifespan, we learn from each other. So there's this deep power in connection and relationships, and how do we lean into that? I think here at Family Life, we have the idea that we are our greatest tools, as in people. The people are the greatest tools that we have to soothe and regulate each other. But of course, conversely, what we see is disconnection. And we see that whether we work with our families or the communities or the systems that we are part of, because pain, as John has already said, pain in a relational context is not lived once. It is a wound that is continuous for the rest of that person's life. And we see how it rewires the brain. And when I say brain, I don't only talk about our brains, but our collective brains. We think about a community brain or a system brain and how that's rewired to fire differently because of trauma experiences. And so if we take our knowledge primarily coming from our therapeutic space, but then span it out into community and system, what we see is shame and fear and behaviours that we would describe as maladaptive, but are completely functional. From a trauma lens, we know that maladaptive behaviour makes a lot of sense functionally for that individual or that community under the context that they're living in. And what that looks like is often violence, aggression, extreme mental health, or behaviours that don't necessarily help around well-being. So at Family Life, that's been our real focus, Jo, is building what we call our trauma-capable model of care across our organisation that encompasses all our work. Because we fundamentally believe that trauma recovery or relational repair is completely possible, but the kicker is you can't do it on your own. I think relationships are what heal. They hurt, but they heal. And so some of the things we're thinking about is really how do we lean into this concept of love and belonging, radical optimism, I call it, and thinking about the power of all the relationships you might have with the people you support, but the communities you work in, the systems that you form part of, how do you bring that together and reimagine that? And that's what we're thinking about at Family Life. And I think that deep sense of we've got to commit to build that support system around families.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I suppose building on that a little bit, you'd be really interested to talk a little bit more about how you as an organisation are building that practice in your own organisation. And, when we spoke before this call, we talked about, there's lots of regulation, there's lots of professional norms that sit around the way we work, and that often constrains people as individual professionals and practitioners, as well as the system writ larger, from perhaps reacting and responding in that relational way. So how do you and your team navigate that? How have you, create the environment in which you can be truly trauma informed?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a journey I guess we're on. But if I move from my organisation perhaps to myself in my own professional capacity, Jo, I've spent a lot of my career having these two joint identities. I'm clinically trained, so I had that kind of clinical expertise of working with individuals, and started in child protection and moved through those pathways. And I had this whole experience of being exposed to trauma theory through that. And then at the same time, was always deeply interested in community activation, place-based work, how community could be partners to change. What I discovered is that we have these two buckets of incredible wisdom. So, all the work John and colleagues have done around how you do systems change, how do you really bring about complex change, and then all this rich wisdom about the neurobiology of trauma and what it does to humans and how it impacts on relationships. What we don't do generally is bring that wisdom together. So it's often sitting in completely different parts of the sector, in the world, in the professional space, and we don't cross the line. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge how much wisdom you already have, how much wisdom is relevant to this conversation in everybody around the call tonight, and really giving yourself permission to lean into that. Often what I experience with my own staff is when we have these conversations, people just say, it just makes absolute sense. That's such common sense. It's almost a permission giving to lean into relationships and connection, because we are almost trained out of that. So a lot of it's been my own personal journey of allowing my two parts of my brain, professional brain, to connect up and integrate again and to honor those two pieces. And I think just accepting that whether I'm working with a family or whether my organization's working with a family, whether we're working in a community, whether I'm working with a system, the relationships are the same because they're all made up of people. And so I can bring my whole self as a practitioner, as a therapist, as a CEO. I can bring that whole identity to the table and be human in that space. And that's probably what's going to help us move the most. So what does that mean for how do I support my staff and how do I, create that kind of culture of change? I think the first thing for me is actually seeing trauma. I think we have very little awareness or ability to see trauma at all. And I think that expansion out from the individual family unit to acknowledging the community and then acknowledging the system around it. So, I think one of the most interesting reflections, one of my clinical practitioners it kind of reflected when we were talking about the individual work and the community work. She reflected that often we have the opportunity to be the frontal cortex for the system. We have the opportunity to co-regulate with the system. And when you think about what we do therapeutically with families, we can become transitional attachment objects. We can co-regulate. We can create safety and rhythm and routine. So we can do all of that work. So, what we don't do necessarily is recognize that when we're sitting in a town hall or a community hall, all of us have had those tough spaces with groups of people. When people are quite anxious or dysregulated or avoidant, we're not leaning into that rich wisdom of how do we operate clinically or professionally when we see disorganized attachment, when we see avoidant attachment, when relationships are broken down, how do we bring all that wisdom to the table? So Jo's still on the journey, but a couple of things. I think the mindset, shifting that mindset, building at the speed of trust, working at the speed of trust. I want to acknowledge there's Weaver on the call who taught me that around working at the speed of trust. I've always kept that. And I think always starting with attunement with the system or the community or the individual, and coaching and skills building. I just want to call out, I think we really underestimate how much coaching and skills building is required for people. And then that long-term support that's needed in that space. So they might have gone a bit on there, but that's a bit of a summary, Jo.
That's amazing. Thank you. John, I'm going to bring you in because I know your paper does talk really some really interesting ways about how we recognize trauma in a system. What does a traumatized system look like? And what challenges does that present in the way that we engage? I think what Allison's just said is we need to go back to some of the wisdom that we have as practitioners and as humans in the way that we relate to the system. But I wonder what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, I think as we've gotten deeper into the work, one of the things we're trying to help people sort of consider and think about is what's a trauma-led system look like and versus what would be a healing-led system, right? And we have a colleague, Louise Mera, in New Zealand, who's like fond of saying, you don't want to be led by trauma, right? You don't want trauma driving the bus, right? So, and yet, so what does it look like? Well, it looks like, the vast majority of systems today, right? There's huge amounts of, so if you think about it from a structural standpoint, resources aren't flowing to the people who need them. Policies don't appreciate, again, what's needed in terms of those that are most vulnerable and marginalized. Relationships and connections, we've talked about that. They're disconnected. Power doesn't, again, sort of connect people that are in formal authority to people that, are sort of in community. And then we have mental models that are very, focused on the individual as opposed to the community or the system. So I think that describes most all the systems I know, unfortunately. I think it's a cultural thing in the modern world, in the Western world, and the areas that have been colonized that, this is mostly what our systems are made up of. But I think the important thing is that they don't need to be that way. And I'll just mention now, because I don't want to go on for too long. One of the things that I think I've really learned is, so how do you move from a trauma-led system to a system that's more healing led? And I think we're starting to talk about the notion of you can't do it everywhere, all the time, in every place. But what you can seek to start to create are what we're calling, and others are starting to call, islands of coherence, where you're bringing together people, it could be part of a community, it could be part of the system where people are interested, because you've got to be invited into this work. You can't force people to, say, let's get together and start to move from trauma to healing. So parts of the system will start to cohere, will start to co-regulate in their nervous system because they're doing this work and they're doing it collectively. And that's the important part. They're doing it collectively. And that island of coherence, let's just take education. That could be a teacher just doing their own inner work and showing up differently in a classroom. And that affects the classroom differently. And that could get, the school could start to see there's a different way to operate, which could be taken on by the district, so on and so on. So it could happen every level. It can even happen, and I think many people would call, are aware of or engaged in collective impact efforts. That's a particularly powerful opportunity to bring together a cross-sector set of people and to actually have them sort of work towards becoming an island of coherence. So yeah, I mean, that's the way we're starting to think about it from the standpoint. And, we've got lists, and I think we had one that's sort of attached to the initial article, if you look in Stanford, that sort of looked at all the different ways, if you look at sort of 6 conditions of systems change, that systems are dysfunctional. It's kind of a depressing list. And again, because a lot of it looks like the fragmentation, disconnection that we have in systems today. But if we're going to start to move towards something that's more healing oriented, how do we look for places where we can start to develop islands of coherence that then connect to other islands of coherence?
That's really helpful, and I think connects to one of the questions that we wanted to explore is how do we do that? So, the focus of this is on vulnerable places, vulnerable communities. And so I wonder whether you have your thoughts, your advice as practitioners, talking to a practitioner audience. How do we weave healing in systems into the way that we work? What would be the practical things that we could do? I mean, but I'll ask you first, John, and then bring you in, Alison, on the same question, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And the example I'm going to give you is probably one of the, arguably highest challenge areas to try to do this healing work. It's in Colombia, the country, and it was organized. This effort to move from trauma to healing was organized by a group called DUNA. They're involved in peace and conflict resolution, and some may know that in 2016 there had been a decades-long conflict between government and communities and sort of guerrillas in the jungle, and there was a peace accord that was signed, but there's still a lot of violence that exists today. And so Duna is focused on going into communities and really sort of working, literally in a cross-sector way. So they're bringing together victims of violence with public forces and government and ex-combatants, guerrillas living in the jungle. And literally, I always say, if you want to change the system, get the system in the room. And so they were getting the system in the room, not everybody, but representatives of all these different players. And so, and then they sort of facilitated collective work at 3 levels. And the first was body-centered work. And so they were engaging this system in the room and practices such as conscious breathing and deep relaxation, interceptive yoga exercises and meditation. And just think about this. You have people in the same room, some who have been tortured and killed in their families by others, and they're breathing the same air. They're doing this work together, this body-centered work. And so that was just, can we actually have people enter and be in the room? The second was they actually started focusing on this notion of relationships and repairing broken relationships and listening and nonviolent communication and co-regulation. And so, sort of mix of body and relational strategies allows for significant changes in the nervous system, and then things start to open up. And I think for me, one of the things that I really appreciate that I probably didn't 5 or 10 years ago about trauma and healing is that when one starts to heal, and I can think of my own, healing, that this has been true, you start to see things you didn't before. You start to see the world in a different way, right? And to me, that's the opportunity for collective healing, right? Because if the collective can start to see the world in a different way, then we can actually start to address some of these existential challenges. So it started with body work, moved to repairing broken relationships, and then they moved to actually engaging in work together. And in this instance, they're focusing on projects that are related to the earth where violence has been committed on the earth. So it's things like regenerative agriculture. And it's bringing these groups together differently. And you can say, on the surface of things, it's not too different than like when we bring cross-sector groups together, to do work. But it's in how they do the work is fundamentally hugely different. And the preparation that's required even before you do what we think of as work, they were doing the work, the body work, the relationship work before they even do the quote unquote work. So yeah, hopefully that gives you some sense of how to think about it.
Yeah, and resonates really strongly with some of the things that you brought out in collective impact in a way, isn't it? It's building that sort of shared ambition, by connecting different experiences. So, and also says to me that it plays a critical role in this, because that is the altitude
Sure.
this work works, right? Because you need that relation, you need people in the room.
Absolutely.
Allison, come to you.
Yeah, when I think of this work, I once again deeply lean into the rich wisdom, and I privilege the wisdom of my First Nations colleagues here in Australia, who are really leading the way in terms of calling for us to think of whole of family, whole of community, just privileging connection and relationships over all else, I guess. And I'm always deeply touched and moved by my Aboriginal colleagues who speak of the concept of songlines here in Australia, and how important songlines are. They are traditional Aboriginal walking trails across our country, but they're also lines of connection and deep, deep historical storytelling. And for me, I'm always inspired when I hear Aboriginal leaders, our First Nations leaders, speak of the power of story and listening. So a couple of very simple, practical things that we have started to adopt in our practice. And I'll share a couple of key words. I think always listening, just listen and listen and listen some more, because trauma really shuts down listening and hearing. Storytelling is incredibly powerful. We've always known this. And I think a lot of this is leaning into deep primal wisdom and allowing us just to be human. Sometimes I think we've got a little bit too smart. So we've just got to get back to the humanity of it all. And I think storytelling, we know this from our narrative therapy work historically, but it's equally important in that community context. And a word that I'm apprenticing with at the moment in our organization, I'm just loving it, is the concept of play. I think, humans learn how to be humans through play. Kids have figured out connection pretty well. They know how to get onto a playground and kick a football and just make friends with each other. And there's actually some significant psychological work happening there between two kids on a playground. So more and more, we're just talking about how do we create the opportunity for play. If you get play right, you get talking right, you get communication right, people start connecting, they start listening. So I think those easy kind of high-order concepts that really bring about a change, listening, storytelling, and play, all lead to empathy. And when we start to empathize with each other as humans, we naturally start to hum together. I like to think about a hum that happens between people. You just start connecting, you get that buzz together. You're like, I'm having fun, yeah, I'm connecting up with you and I feel better. And I think there's something about that magical hum. So are we thinking a lot about those kind of practical ways we can build that into all of our work? And in my organization, that's creating a lot of energy and fun, because it's about risk and power sharing. And it's that concept that John spoke about. We know that we get better off, we feel better as people when we do this work, when we power share and we risk share and we play with people around us. So those are the things that are front of mind for me, Jo, in a practical way.
That's really, really interesting. And I think some of the things I'm hearing is, and I think we're used to, when we're thinking about systems, is we think about the wiring in systems, the policy, the procedures, and in fact, what you're both saying is actually we need to go back to the relational, invest in the relationship, sometimes just for that sake, and then things come out of that which allow us to tackle the system in a different way. So,
Jo, can I just add in there? And I think, relational can be an overused word in our sector. And people think it's like, oh yeah, we just do relationships. I have a relationship with so and so organization. I think what we're talking about is something that's deeper. When you're talking about, the central nervous system and an understanding of how that plays into this at both an individual and a systems level. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that's the part for me that, I think we are as a sector getting more trauma informed, but it's still pretty limited in terms of trauma informed. When we think about people in senior positions, et cetera, it's probably more available on the front line, so to speak. And so I think it's, for me, yes, absolutely relationships, and it's understanding what we mean that is going to sort of a deeper level than just showing up and having a conversation.
I'm glad you said that. I think that's one of the challenges of this work in general, that we need to peel the onion a little bit around what we really mean by, phrases we use a lot, but has much deeper meaning. So thank you for that. Let's just take, I'm hogging all the questions to see if there's a couple that were coming from the chat. Emily, I don't know whether you can, is there anything?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John and Allison, for that. That was really, really thought-provoking. We had a couple, 2 or 3 really good questions. One from Rachel to Allison about what your learnings may have been in working in this way with government, state agencies and institutions, those that might not be, as John said, as used to talking about trauma and as comfortable, making that transparent. And related to that is a question from Tamanda about, are there times when it may be actually more harmful to try to address it? Because, what if you've never had a relationship with the system beyond trauma? And that is the baseline of experience for some communities and some individuals. Could it be unhelpful to co-regulate and attune to a system that's not recognizing the trauma that has been caused? So 2 kind of related questions, if we can start with Allison.
Yeah, I have the interesting professional background of having worked in government for over a decade, albeit in a very different context in South Africa. So probably not in such a westernized, setting. But I have an appreciation for systems, and I have appreciation that systems are made up of people who are genuinely good, because people are genuinely good. It's one of my kind of North Stars in my life. So when I think about working with government, I always just think about working with people, and I encourage you to think about who those people are, whether they be a minister, whether they be a senior individual. It is about relationships. And I always go into every engagement, whether I'm talking to the most senior person in government, with a sense that this is a human being in front of me who is trying to do good and perhaps is struggling or not seeing something that I'm seeing, or perhaps I'm not seeing something that they're seeing. So how do I co-create some meaning to move us forward in this space? I also appreciate parts of systems that I think we often don't speak about, which I think, systems are built to hold risk, and, there is risk that is held in systems. And I don't think we always ever talk about the fact that we can't move away from that. And, I idealistically believe that there are systems that can hold a lot more risk in community, but there are sometimes when we want the system to come in and help us. And I've never found it useful to have an adversarial relationship. It's about finding common purpose in that space and sharing risk and defining models of doing that. So a simple rule of thumb for me, and I've had lots of conversations with my staff around this, is never be difficult with the system for purpose sake. Pick up the phone, have a conversation, find the human on the other end of the world, and try and discover what's going on for them, and try and find out what the fear and the shame and the concern and the fear on the other end is, and how do we work together more broadly. I always work in individual relationship space. So for me, although that work then spans from individuals into families, families into communities, into systems, our model of working would not be to push an entire community into contact with the system. We don't work on that level. We work in a place. And so we're always working on the individual relationship. We might be in a room and we acknowledge there are different structural power dynamics, but we are trying to normalize that. We're trying to have people with lived experience and living experience in the room with the right decision makers who can support them. We're trying to create space for that voice. We're trying to, protect and almost remove power out of those dynamics. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that second question, but I think it is more nuanced on the ground. It's not necessarily about pushing a whole community into contact with a whole system. It's about creating points of connection. And I think John's example from Colombia is just magical in terms of saying sometimes we create a bit of a boogeyman around the system, but the system is people, and we need to try and get people in the room together. And that's when we get real empathy and movement.
To that I would add, I do think in this work, there's a lot of preparation that may be required. So just to oversimplify things, government agency leaders on one side of the river and community members on the other side of the river, you might need to do work with both groups before they jump in the river together. Just one very brief example, in the United States, there's a group called Futures Without Violence, and they work with women who are victims of domestic violence. And they actually created this program, and they did it on Zoom, where they had women, and they worked with the women for a while to make sure that they could feel their voice, they felt like they had something to say, and ultimately they showed up on Zoom with government agency leaders. And they said, here's what we think needs to happen. And, the leaders needed to basically just listen and then, sort of go away and think about it. And then they had like a second and a third and a fourth conversation. And then ultimately that led to changes. And, people didn't get all that they wanted, but it was a very closely facilitated process. And the leaders were prepared before they showed up. And the women were prepared before they showed up. And by and large, I think they're it was a very positive process for everybody. So I think the preparation in this work, particularly around the nervous system, is a lot.
Thank you both so much for that. Jo, do we have time for one other question, or should we come back to that later?
Yeah, I'm going to come back if that's okay. Please keep putting your questions in. And thank you, Allison and John, for that. I think please stay on, because we're going to come to some Q&A at the end. What I'm going to do is invite Lauren and Cormac to come in now, and just to get your sort of reflections, really. But Lauren, can I come to you first? Just tell us first of all about your work with For Baby's Sake, and how you see trauma sort of showing up in your work in relation to people and the system more generally.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a really fascinating discussion, so much to think about. So the For Baby's Sake Trust was set up to really seeking to understand what was happening within families, particularly related to the homicide of babies and young children. And what we found in those early days that kept coming up time and time again was the role of domestic abuse, but also the intergenerational nature of domestic abuse running throughout families. So For Baby's Sake gives trauma-informed therapeutic support to families starting in pregnancy where there's domestic abuse, working up until the baby's second birthday. So we've been doing trauma for quite a long time in the space of domestic abuse, where there are huge levels of trauma on every level. And I think we had an event yesterday announcing our new team in the east of England, lots of local partners, providers in the room, lots of frontline workers, but also national government, also Department for Education, Home Office. And it was a really interesting example of what it looks like to have different elements of the system in the room together. And we're not afraid to talk about trauma. We'll always talk about trauma. But for us, it's really understanding what does it mean to be a trauma-informed charity within this space as well. And for us, it's about experiencing, helping people experience and talk about what we're all living with, that it's this constant sense of othering. It's somebody else over there. It's not my family. It's not my street. It's not my community. And so we developed something called an emotional safety plan to support mothers and fathers on their journey through pregnancy. But we also, through co-production, developed one for professionals supporting families going through pregnancy. And so what we found at that event at the end, people were coming up to us afterwards saying, I wish I'd had for baby's sake, I wish I'd had that support in pregnancy to really explore my history and how that's impacted how I feel, how I parent. And so I think for us, really, reading your article, John and Allison, and the webinar that you were on last week, Cormac, just really thinking about that need for collective healing. ONS had new stats on Friday around levels of domestic abuse in the UK, and they've looked at different ways of recording domestic abuse now. So the levels are much higher than previously thought. So one in three women experience domestic abuse, 1 in 5 men. So much, much higher numbers, you see. And that's not an othering, that's a really significant proportion of the community. And so it's really thinking about how do we create collective healing when there's that level of intergenerational harm. And it begins with all of us, but it begins with feeling like we can be vulnerable. And that's just looking at domestic abuse. We could apply this in so many other areas. My son has an Ofsted inspection in his primary school this week, and I really feel it for the head teacher because we live in the area where head teacher Ruth Perry took her life when Ofsted came out to her school. And when you talk about harm in systems, what would drive a primary school head teacher to take their life? And they've said that the Ofsted inspection was part of that. So how can we hope to heal children within those schools and within those systems when that's how a head teacher was feeling? And so I think for us in our work, it's yes, looking at our trauma-informed work with our parents, but we've got to apply this to all of us as individuals and to all of us within our own communities.
Super helpful. And I think, we're more used to that, aren't we, in clinical medical models where we look after, you have, clinical supervision that doesn't translate into other environments for some reason, but of course it should, because we all bring ourselves, as Alison said earlier, to work and affect it. I wonder as well, because you work in an area of quite, where there's serious risk to families, and Alison mentioned risk, and it's a fascinating area, and we see it in the work where one of the things where somehow we see more healing behaviors, as you like, is where there's a more collective approach to risk, where professionals are supported perhaps to think outside the usual boundaries, lean into families more, work together collectively to perhaps share risk in a different way. And I wonder whether you see any of that in your work or that resonates at all.
Well, we know with domestic abuse, the biggest challenge is shame and stigma. And so that makes it very difficult for families to share what they're going through. So a Domestic Abuse Commission report that came out last week shared that only 0.5% of women disclose domestic abuse during that early pregnancy journey, when we know it should be probably as much as 12 times that amount. So a huge part of our work is how do you break down that shame and stigma so that people feel able to talk about what's happening to them and open up those systems, because that collective shame and that collective blame is not serving anybody. So I think there's a challenge within our systems. Yes, we need to have really high levels of safeguarding to protect our children and families, but not to such an extent that we're covering up and we're blaming others. Again, it's what does it look like to collectively heal and to support one another with that, rather than saying that's someone else's problem or that it was that social worker that failed that family, rather than it was a collective. It's a collective failing. It's how do we work together to support that? So we definitely deal with that every day in our work. And when we began, we were very pioneering because we worked with those that use abusive behaviours. We worked with co-parents. And we still have situations where we're having to defend that way of working. But if we're not working with those who are using abusive behaviors and showing harm, so we're not seeking to understand what happened to you, nothing's going to change. And so it's it's tough work, but we have to show up in that space.
And that's so interesting. I think that there's an openness and transparency that needs to come in, that we need to be open to sharing our individual experiences. I think John said something of that in his piece around, we just need to understand it, see it, name it, to be able to deal with it. So yeah, that's very interesting. Cormac, let me bring you in. You did a very good webinar with Bruce Perry and talked very, very interestingly around trauma in relation to some of your thinking around communities, strengths-based practice. Can you tell a little bit more about your thinking, your experience around this?
Thanks, Jo, and thanks, John and Allison and Lauren as well. There's an expression that says, "Healer, heal thyself," and I just want to appreciate the fact that I think we're hearing people who've done some of their own work. One of the challenges, myself and Bruce have talked a little bit about this, is that so often in the institutional world, where we have people who are trying to use systems in service of healing, that if we're in a scenario personally where we're trying to heal other people's versions of traumas we haven't even begun to engage with within our own healing journey, then we're risking counterproductivity. And I think that sometimes that can actually amass to collective impact of counterproductivity. So acknowledging that trauma has, in many respects, been repressed, that we desensitize from it, that we disassociate from it in all kinds of ways, individually and institutionally, and that can become institutionalized, is really important. So healing, is not a performative act. We know that. So therefore, it's something that's done within the person and within a culture when folks aren't standing watching over your shoulder. That's the hard piece around it. So orchestrating that or creating performative techniques or institutionalizing or professionalizing that is, like trying to catch the wind in a net. It's just, it's maladaptive in that sense, if you want to use those terms. So a lot of our work is really recognizing that the container within which healing might happen isn't the carcass of the individual necessarily, but the context of community within which individuals can collectivize to be whole. And that journey from, languishing to flourishing, towards thriving, towards wholeness, is bidirectional. So it's both deeply personal and deeply communal. But many of certainly what I'm curious about today is that many of the supposed healing dynamics are creating huge hurt. So they're compounding trauma, both for the healer and the person that may be thought of as at the other side of that healing. And that happens in all kinds of ways. Language. So we have people who are trying to journey with folks leaving prison, and they call them ex-prisoners. That's a great language barrier, instead of calling them community returners. Or we have healers who only journey with the community returners, but don't understand that the real work is actually also working with the community so that they can receive the gifts of those community returners. And in all kinds of ways, shifting the narrative away from my job as a healer is to disassociate from my personal journey, keep it professional, and then to fix those that I think are broken. Well, healing by nature is the move towards wholeness, not fragmentation. And so it's a massive, massive calling to kind of get beyond, thinking about my job as a practitioner, if I'm lucky enough to receive a salary to serve others, as fixing or advising or rescuing or directing, and really moving into this. What does community animation look like? How do I move past a narrative that says these people are broken or damaged or needy, to recognizing the trauma, recognizing the harm, recognizing the hurt, and also recognizing the gift and the agency, acknowledging the structural oppression, but not undercutting people's agency in order to do it. And I think that moves us into a conversation where everybody actually has a contribution, and in a sense, it's a communitarian process. We can't, 100 years of science on happiness is clearly telling us it's not a solo run. You can't do this on your own. So a lot of what we're seeing, and I think it resonates in our work, is there seems to be sort of three lenses with which I think an awful lot of institutions are trying to approach the journey of being useful. And one lens is therapeutic. There is an individual with a problem. Let's do something dyadically to them or with them, that creates or affects healing. The other is advocacy. This person has a right to services, has a right to interventions. Let's make sure they're interagency coordinated, no wrong door, wraparound, seamless, so on and so forth. It's advocating for the first, in a way, advocating for more therapy or more intervention, but it's still very top down. And the third is community. Start at the center with the kin, with the family, with the community, with the person, and with their contributions. But also acknowledge the advocacy piece really matters and the therapy piece really matter. And a lot of what our work is revealing, and I think what Bruce's work and the work we're hearing about in this important conversation are revealing, is it's not about any one of these having dominance over the others. It's about them being in right relationship. It's an indigenous wisdom, a way of being in relationality with all things, ourselves, but also with our places, our cultures, and our trauma then becomes kind of it's not a barrier, it's a threshold. It's the mythic, poetic kind of dragon protecting the gold. It's a threshold. We've got to be able to look it in the eye. So we talk a lot about starting with what's strong, but I would always emphasize that's not so we can turn our face away from what's wrong, but so that we can use our strength to address those challenges and move past the threshold. So trauma in a lot of ways is a threshold moment into which wholeness becomes more possible if we acknowledge it, if we engage it. I don't think we can do that by simply pathologizing people or medicalizing people or top-down approaches. So there's a huge healing both for our institutions and for us as communities, which needs to be undergone. And I think a lot of the examples we've heard already are examples of doing that.
Thank you for that. And lots of resonance between both of you, I think, around, having that transparency, removing shame, seeing things from strengths, acknowledging, changing the language for it is incredibly important, because we do pathologize, and that others people, doesn't it, continually. So I wonder what you see as the opportunities in your own work to shift this perspective, thinking about vulnerable communities and people, thinking about healing systems. In the UK, what and listening also to Allison and John in terms of what their reflections are, where are the opportunities, do you think, for us to shift the dial on this?
Well, just briefly, I think there's so many, and I think it's important that we're hopeful in a very grounded way. So in the UK at the moment, what's alive for me, and I've just shared a paper that has just landed in the last hour, published by New Local kindly, which tries to unpack some of my thinking around this, using an example of a city in the UK, Leeds, where they've chosen to respond to the challenges around social care from a very community first perspective. And the power of actually resourcing neighborhoods in Leeds with community animators that are doing this community building work while also being respectful of the trauma and the narratives, which can both I think, in very meaningful ways and moving ways, communicate the story of now and the story of how people and what has happened to people, but at the same time supporting people to be in conversations about how they want to use their agency, how they want to use their power, and how they want to be served. So in the paper, what I'm trying to describe is that we actually have two beautiful tools for change. One is wrapped, it's humans organizing within institutions. The other is, it's humans organizing within communities. And in a sense, what we need to figure out is how we can align those so they can be in better relationship. The paper argues that one of the best ways to do that is if you're lucky enough to be in an institution, figure out how you can be in a supplementary rather than a supplanting role. Really attend to how you're foregrounding the voices and the choices and the agency of the people you serve, even if they may not necessarily see their power yet, but holding that in trust and opening that space. So some of that is about leading by stepping back. And we see, I try to write about this, but we see this in Leeds. It's saying we could take our money, we could commission more services, more top-down approaches, but we could also relocate authority and resource and make sure that that resource is in the community, because we can't engage with communities until we first support the individuals who live there to build community. It's a process. It goes at the speed of trust. It's like any process. It's complex. There's baggage in it. So taking time and investing, this is not a 3-year funding cycle. This is generational. So we've got to invest in, we talk about collective impact, but there are embedded intermediaries that are committed to the journeying work in neighborhoods of staying there for 25, 50 years. So let's find out ways, and we're seeing this in Leeds and other places, where we can do the important healing work, but also we can align our resources so that folks locally can journey alongside people. I talk about this in the paper. The trick is to move from being, distant, cold outsiders to trying to be useful outsiders and figuring out how we can align our systems so it's to serve people. But also there are great practitioners, and I see them every day, I know we all do on this call, who are getting alongside people, but are also respecting their autonomy and their sovereignty. So I think,
yes,
these are things worth cheering on, worth celebrating.
that is a point so well made that I think it's not giving empowerment, means stepping back from power in many ways. Not people don't expect people, particularly traumatized people, to ask for power. You have to, in a sense, step back and make that power available. So it's really important, lots of important points, but that one particularly chimes. Lauren, any sort of reflections from you on that, or how kind of you see those?
I think as well, it's empowering, thinking about where community lies now. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to see the more in common this place matters research that's come out this week, which shares that 44% of Brits sometimes feel like strangers. And it's much higher in areas of lower income. And I think it's around where really understanding where community lies and empowering community leaders within those communities. I read a really helpful book this week by a specialist around Muslim communities and domestic abuse, and it was really looking at resilience and sport and strength-based approach within those communities, and how actually community leaders within that space can really serve to help reintegrate survivors of domestic abuse back into the community, who often feel very lonely and very cut out and have got a crucial role. So some of that, I think, is around how do you bring, as Allison said, these different aspects of learning and thought together to help to really understand where community lies and to really help to build up those communities to feel empowered to be able to work on these big social issues and feel that they can make a really, probably the most meaningful difference. I think in the space of domestic abuse, again, we leave it to domestic abuse services, we leave it to social care, but actually those community leaders in these spaces are absolutely crucial for reaching those families and breaking that shame and stigma. So I think that would be my thought.
Well, we go on to Q&A, and I'll just, before forewarn people, if you please post questions, and I'm going to ask you if you'd like to come in and ask questions directly in a couple of minutes to use the reactions box, the thing at the bottom of the Zoom, to raise your hand, and I'll come to you and you can ask a question directly. But I think that, that's really interesting. And I wonder what your reflections would be, Cormac, just coming to you first, on John's comment, which I was just thought was particularly interesting in the context of our work, that we use the word relational a lot. And how do we deepen our understanding of relational work such that it isn't just something that appears in every single evaluation report ever written on place-based change, but it's something that we deepen our practice around relational? And is trauma one of the ways in your minds that we understand that deepening that practice?
Yeah, I really, really appreciate John saying that. And I think particularly given the depth of his experience, I think it's an incredibly important thing to put out there for all of us. It really got me thinking. One of the things I was reflecting on is you could see, for example, in play, we were talking about play earlier on. You can see kids in parallel play. So to the untrained eye, it looks like they're in a relationship. They're doing something. It's the same thing. They're in the same room, but clearly they're not relating. And a lot of the time, what I, in speaking and listening deeply with communities here, is we're experiencing a lot of the folks who are alongside us, but it feels like parallel play. We're not experiencing mutual alliance. We're not experiencing the building of power, the challenging of structural oppression, etc. So it's relational insofar as it's relational, but it's not consequential. And in that sense also, I hear a lot of people say that there are thresholds and boundaries which are really important. And then there's stuff that gets in the way of really meaningfully building mutual alliance, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. I'd recently, we were working with a team of professionals, and I asked three simple questions just to get things going. So the first question is, what do you like doing in your practice? And nearly everybody, they talked about the things that were personal, that were connecting, that were building, meaningful relationships, and particularly talking about where they actually see people flourish on their own 2 feet. So a lot of that story-based sharing. I asked them then what they did, which they disliked doing, and of course, report writing and such like came up. But I was really struck by the number of people who were saying that, largely they disliked doing things that were harmful in some way to the agency of the people that they served. And sometimes that came at people while wearing the mask of love. So, practitioners had a very deep and visceral understanding that that was wrong. That was a way of relating to people which masquerades as care, but actually carries harm. And I think we have to pay a lot of attention to how helpers approach what they're doing, but also how institutions, I think increasingly institutions that are saying they care are not really checking their own narratives. To me, there's a lot of institutions that are engaged in structural racism. There's a lot of institutions that are moving into communities, overwhelming, displacing, undermining. We very rarely hear conversations about that iatrogenic impact that, institutions that on the face of it look like they're in relationship with community. And I think the reason we don't hear it is because there's kind of a working assumption that institutions are benign. They can only do good. But actually, and it's a question that's put in the chat there, what about the institutions that inadvertently are doing harm? So there's a whole process, I think, whereby we need to support practitioners that are working in the lives of people to do their reflective practice, to really think about power in their relationships. And there's that expression, check our privilege, but there's a huge amount of agency that comes with being a professional paid practitioner in a situation where somebody's experiencing trauma. And I'm saddened not by the practice, but I'm saddened by the number of practitioners that I encounter. The third question I ask is, how often do you get a chance to reflect on your practice and your relationships? And how many people say to me, there is no space for reflective practice. I get supervised, my work gets audited, but I'm hardly ever supported to reflect on my practice. And I think until we do that, it's going to be very, very hard to really reflect on relationships, power, and consequence.
Yeah, and reflection is a form of accountability, isn't it, to ourselves and to others? So, yeah, I really hear that. That's incredibly helpful. What we'll do now, just again, I don't want to hog the whole thing. Emily, just looking at the Q&A, and again, if you would like to come in now, offer some reflections, comments, questions, please do. We'll bring John and we'll bring John back in. And if Alison is still awake, she could have given us, she's not, Alison. And perhaps just pick a couple of the questions out of the Q&A and say, and please come in if you'd like to.
I'm happy to just kick off with a couple of questions while others are preparing to raise their hand and bring in their other questions. But thank you, Lauren and Cormac, so much for that. So much to reflect on. And I think the couple of questions that came through the chat were kind of related for me, which is for organizations and individuals who haven't really started this work of understanding their own selves and what they're bringing to this, their own power, agency, and also their own trauma. What would you kind of give as advice or coaching around where to start? Because Sylvia mentioned in the chat, the islands of coherence might have to start around organizations who already have done a lot of thinking about this, because many haven't. And another question came from Danielle about what can leaders in these institutions do to open themselves up to their own trauma and to their own understanding of their own power. So any thoughts there from all of you? Maybe we could start with Allison and John.
Go ahead, Allison. Okay. Well, I love the question. I think the biggest teacher you can have in this work is your own experience. And most all of us have some history of trauma, even if it's intergenerational trauma. And I do think the best, I don't know, the most best, whatever you want to call it, learning that I've had around this has been just really investigating my own, doing my own inner work. And so like that would be sort of the number one piece of advice I have for anybody. If you're interested in this and you haven't really explored, done your own inner work, that's absolutely the best place to start. You can take courses and those can be helpful, but this isn't a cognitive thing. It's embodied. It's embodied. I think part of the challenge is that, as we've sort of done our, as we're sort of trying to sort of help as we can, and as all of everybody on this call is trying to sort of open this up as a topic that's more universally embraced, is when you say you need to do your inner work, it's really invitation only. I mean, you can invite people into this, but you can't force them to do their own inner work. But I think there are ways to sort of help people into this. And I do find that to be one of the biggest challenges. So when we talk about islands of coherence, yes, I do think it's where people have gotten the thirst for this. We are a society that's starved for intimacy. So I think more and more people are consciously seeking out ways to better understand this. And, we just did a course on healing-centered systems change this spring. It's the first time we've done it. And we had people from 22 countries represented. And so I think that's sort of the first thing is that has to be part, as Cormac said so articulately, it has to be a part of the work. If you want to do the work, you've got to do the work on yourself. And I think it's as well, leaders and I think leaders of agencies and institutions, we can talk about the folks that are sort of, are experiencing oppression, but if the leaders aren't doing this work, they can cause huge amounts of, they've got connections, resources, they can cause huge amounts of harm. And we talked a little bit about that. And so inviting leaders to do this work, I think, is absolutely critical. And doing it not only individually, but collectively. I think that's what I think has been our experience has been, where can we create communities of practice so that people like themselves, they can invite that and realize that they all, many people have the same questions. So to me, that is absolutely the place to start. And I love, love, love the question. So thank you for asking it.
Thank you very much. Emily, anything else from the Q&A? And if there is anybody who feels brave enough, I know this is a very august audience, that would like to offer their reflections or ask a question or a comment directly, please do. Whilst you're thinking about it, I wonder, now all of you have heard each other speak, whether there's any reflections on what each other have said around some of this. And what I'm really struck by, and it hadn't landed in my head before we had this discussion, is that importance of creating this needs to become the new normal, in the sense that leaders and others need to invest in understanding trauma because ultimately the people who are architects of systems that deliver systems are all course human. So they're all, in a sense, led by how we behave, how we see the world. So there is almost a requirement on people. It's part of their personal responsibility, and as leaders and holding those responsibilities as owners of or architects or drivers of systems, that they understand what they bring to that work. So it feels like a long journey, but a really important one, that we're shifting a narrative, an expectation around the relationship between the human and the system, and putting it into sharper context. But any other sort of questions coming up or thoughts from the panel?
Perhaps, Jo, just a reflection to add on to what John previously shared. I always stand by my belief or truth that all behavior is functional to the individual. May not make sense to us, might feel harmful, and it absolutely can be harmful, but it's functional to that individual. So, I think of the work that we do, Lauren, you and I have a connection in the space. Family Life does a huge amount of work with people who use violence, and just the enormous advocacy we have done as an organisation to move away from language like perpetrator, to really acknowledge the lived experience of people who have long histories of being victims in their own right, even though they may be using violence, but understanding the complexity of humanity, of being human, and really sitting with that and the storytelling around that. So I think if there was certainly one thing that's helped me as a leader in this space, or trying to figure out how to lead in this space, is just a zero tolerance for shame. I think if we could just have an absolute zero tolerance for shame, because whether we're working with vulnerable people in an individual capacity, or in a community, or in a system, shame is the one thing that shuts our neurosystem down, that just makes us crawl inside and just not be able to engage. So that would just be my contribution, that I know that if I'm moving into a shaming space, John, because something is triggering me, all of us have our own past, and I feel like I'm using my power and my control and I'm shaming, even if that's shaming someone in the system, then I know somehow I've just lost my way, because that's not going to move us to a space of productivity or change or health or well-being. So just wanted to share that in the mix, Jo.
I think actually that's really interesting on a kind of an individual level, and just to get back to that point of us being open about who we are, our own kind of backgrounds and traumas, and and experiences that we're not othering, we're not superior to. But I think we're also in our work seeing increasingly a focus on pride and community, that around shifting the narratives about communities collectively, about who they are, not being disregarded or by other communities are thought to be lesser than. So how can we, and it sort of very chimes, I guess, with Cormac's work on having a strengths-based approach and changing the language, but it's around how do we, if we can shift this kind of who we are, what we are, and allow communities to not feel collectively traumatized or identified as communities that are not as successful as others, that seems kind of really important. Really important in the context of this conversation, perhaps more important in my mind now than I perhaps thought in the past. But
could I also just jump in with a question that's come up a few times in the chat and would love to get your thoughts on from the group? It's about racial trauma and how, Michael asked, how can we repair trauma within systems which constantly create trauma in our everyday lives? So, and I think Matt, from Plymouth in a sort of broader sense, struggling with this sort of experience of wanting to take this kind of conversation out, but receiving sort of the feedback that it's irrelevant or people just really not getting it. But the racial trauma is a real, is a daily struggle. So just any thoughts on that would be really helpful.
I'm happy to come in there. I think it's one that I feel so passionately about. It has to be named, and there's so much silencing of racial trauma. And that relates to your article, John and Allison, around white privilege, failing to acknowledge white privilege or own white privilege, that we'd rather it was just something over there, we're not going to think about it, because if you won't name it, then you won't deal with it and you won't acknowledge how it's impacting communities. And I've seen it time and time again. I began my journey working with children and families, working with children who'd been excluded from school or at risk of exclusion in North London. And that was 20 years ago, and I was seeing the huge disproportionate exclusion of Black Caribbean boys from the school system. And that was my awakening into what was happening for those young people and what was happening within those systems to those boys and the trauma that was causing. And it's only got worse. It hasn't got better. And why hasn't it got better? It hasn't got better because we failed to acknowledge it and we failed to name it. The systemic racism within our school system, and that's just our school system, around what's happening. And that runs very, very deep for those families, very, very deep. And that's really got to be acknowledged. And there needs to be that collective healing and that support for that collective healing. But we won't do that until we name it and we own it and we own what's happening to those communities today.
I guess we really understand it. So it's back to the empathy point. Do we know enough about why people are traumatized? And it that allows us to empathize and understand that experience of trauma in their own context.
And hugely relates to trust. When we talk about, very, very high levels of young people do not have trust, and they do not have trust in systems in that community. And it takes work to build trust, and what does it really mean to build trusting relationships with those young people, with those communities?
Yeah. And I think too often the system shows it doesn't care enough, right? Because money comes and goes, things that are policy priorities or funding priorities, get deprioritized, and people those show really that's the hand the system shows, doesn't it, about what's important to us collectively. So we have a couple of minutes left, so we can squeeze in a last question if there's anything burning and anyone would like to make any final comments. Well, this has felt, certainly for me, like a huge privilege. I think I've learned an enormous amount in the last hour and a half, and feel that much more that we have to center these concepts of healing and trauma in our work writ large. So I think from our point of view, us reflecting on what that means for developing practice in place-based work will be something that we will think much more deeply about with the help of this august group. Thank you for your generosity, all four of you. It's amazing to have each of you on this call. We're really grateful for your time and your wisdom. For those joining us, if you'd like to join our learning community and get invited to future events like this, please go onto our website where you can register for it. We'll make sure that we invite you to future events. So we quarterly at the moment, and then hopefully at least every other month into next year. So we hope you could join us for future events. So with our thanks for all of you joining, and to our audience, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.